This is Valerio from the R3 product management team. And I will be taking you today through the Collaborative Recovery CorDapps, which are part of a new feature that we have added to Corda Enterprise 4.5. So let's start by going over what the Collaborative Recovery CorDapps are. So they are part of a new resiliency layer that we have added on top of Corda Enterprise. They are a disaster recovery technique. Now, Corda already provides operators with access to tried and tested disaster recovery techniques. Corda nodes are backed by relational databases, which means that you can use incremental backups, you can use database replication. But one other thing that can be done to ensure that the critical part of the data that's held in that database, specifically the ledger data, is preserved in case of a disaster or of an abnormal event affecting the data that's held in there, is relying on other peers on the network to make sure that any missing ledger data can be diagnosed and that any missing ledger data can be recovered. So this is something that brings Corda a bit closer to blockchains that have a single shared ledger, a single view of the ledger that's shared by all participants. What happens in Corda is that there's no gossip protocol, there's no global broadcasts of data whenever a new fact is recorded in a network. What happens in Corda is that only the participants that are involved in a specific transaction know about that transaction, which means that recovering lost data from participants is a bit trickier than what would happen in a distributed ledger that has the same view of the ledger for every participant. So what matters for our purpose is that this new technique is one that can be run if every peer in the same business network is involved. If one of the peers is not running these applications, the effectiveness of the technique is undermined, and we'll come to that in a second. So just to give you a quick graphical overview of what collaborative recovery allows you to do, we have here a situation with a network where there's three peers, A, B, and C. So A has participated in two transactions, one that involves B and one that involves C. Now, something bad happens. Let's say that the data center where A's database is running is flooded, or something else happens that creates a disaster and removes all this data from A's database. So what collaborative recovery allows A to do is to go to B and C and say, do you have any transactions where I am involved that I currently don't have in my ledger, and can you supply them back to me? And if everything runs smoothly, what happens is A is able to recover from B and C the missing transactions. So a quick note on when it's worth using collaborative recovery. So as previously mentioned, Corda already allows operators to use conventional DR techniques. Specifically in the context of the ledger, it's incremental, frequent database backups and database replication. So the best layer of protection you can get for your ledger is running synchronous database replication, which in short means that every change to the database that the node is running is also propagated to some replicas of the database, and that no new operation can be run until a commit has been finalized on all the replicas. So this is the most resilient setup you can run. Unfortunately, the fact that you need to wait for all the replicas to acknowledge the write means that there is a performance hit deriving from running synchronous replication, which means this might not be suitable, might not be affordable in scenarios where there's a large throughput that's needed for a CorDapp application. The other scenario where this might be difficult to run is one where an operator wants to keep down costs, and so the cost of running additional replicas of a database might not be sustainable. So in these scenarios, it's worth considering collaborative recovery on top of, at the very least, frequent and incremental database backups as an additional resiliency solution. The other prerequisite is making sure that all peers on a business network are coordinated in running collaborative recovery. And this usually means getting the business network operator on board so that they can coordinate any shared activity and they can make sure that everyone on the network is running the applications for collaborative recovery. So moving on. So what can be recovered via this technique? So this allows you to recover missing transactions, missing attachments, and missing historical network parameters. So these are the contents of the critical ledger tables that are held in a node's database. It's also worth noting that when a missing transaction is inserted, this will also regenerate any data in auxiliary vault tables that are keeping track of data that's part of, let's say, a transaction. For example, the vault states table. So what does collaborative recovery not allow you to recover? So there's a few things that you can't do. Any data kept outside of the node's ledger is not really recoverable via this technique. And this might include, as anyone who's more familiar with the operational side of running a Corda node, as they might know, there's quite a few things that are necessary. So you can't recover any cryptographic keys, you can't recover CorDapp jars, you can't recover messaging queue data, and so on. So all of these need to be accounted for in a disaster recovery strategy, but they can't be recovered via collaborative recovery. Some of our more clued up viewers will also have noticed that any data that has not been shared with other peers on the network is not really recoverable via this technique, because no one else apart from us knows about that data. This includes things like self-issued states that have not been transacted with anyone else, scheduled states, and so on. Furthermore, any data that has been shared with peers that are not available on the network anymore, so they might have temporarily dropped off for maintenance, or they might have left the network, that's not anymore recoverable. Finally, any transactions where we participated as observers, so transactions that were not where we were not participants, but where we use the observer functionality in Corda, are currently not retrievable via collaborative recovery. So collaborative recovery has two main components. There are two CorDapps. The first one is called Ledger Sync, and it allows operators to diagnose differences in the shared ledger data held by peers on the same business network. This is the process that we call reconciliation, and it's done in a very efficient way that involves minimal exchange of data, no sensitive data being shared, and the preservation as much as possible of normal operations on the network. So one of the design considerations we had when we created this feature was making sure that it did not impose too much load on peers that were running it. So reconciliation creates a report on a peer that runs it that says whether their ledger is consistent with the one of other peers on the same network, or whether it's missing any data. If it is missing any data, there's a second phase that is in the process for collaborative recovery that's run through a second CorDapp called Ledger Recover, which, as the name suggests, allows operators to recover missing data that has been diagnosed in a previous step. There's two operating modes of this. One is using the flow framework. So completely within Corda, you're able to recover missing data from your peers. This is suited for smaller amounts of data. And for cases where large amounts of data are missing, there's also a manual import-export procedure for the data that involves conveying the data back outside of Corda, again, not to disrupt regular operation on a network. A quick note on compatibility. Collaborative recovery is supported and tested only on Corda Enterprise 4.5 and above. This practically means that nodes that want to run the Collaborative Recovery CorDapps need to have a minimum platform version of 6. This is because we use some APIs that are not available in previous versions of Corda. In terms of the Corda ecosystem, the Collaborative Recovery API CorDapps are compatible fully with the Tokens SDK. They are compatible with confidential identities and accounts. The only caveat there is that you won't be able to recover private keys for confidential entities and accounts, because those are, of course, never shared with any peers. It is also not possible to recover account info transactions, which are necessary for an account to properly function as part of this release. Finally, Collaborative Recovery is not compatible with the deprecated Corda Finance app, so please don't try and verify whether this works by using it alongside Finance. One note on business networks. So as we mentioned, there's lots of scheduled activities, specific policies around disaster recovery, and also the necessity to maintain a list of business network peers to make sure that collaborative recovery works correctly. This is because, as part of the original design, we didn't want nodes running these applications to be flooding with requests all the nodes they could reach as part of, let's say, the Corda network. So we wanted to limit the operation of this application to a single business network a node is participating on. And this means that there needs to be an active involvement by the business network operator to both disseminate the application throughout all participants, and to make sure that they comply with any policies regarding when to run the applications, what to do when the applications are run, and a discrepancy is found between the ledgers of two nodes, and so on. One thing to note is that if at least a node is not running the applications, the herd immunity effect that the applications provide is lost. So one node not being able to reciprocate the flows that allow for reconciliation and recovery might undermine the recovery strategy for a whole network. So it's important that all the nodes on network are running it. As a side note, we mentioned this is only compatible with Corda Enterprise, so it's currently not suitable for networks that are mixed and run both open source and enterprise nodes. So this concludes the introductory video on collaborative recovery apps. We will follow up this with videos on both Ledger Sync and Ledger Recover that will contain also a demo